So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here, and this is another DIY Christmas decoration video. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I put together a wooden Christmas tree that's going to hold one of the Christmas villages that we've had for years. One of the biggest things I considered when building this is that it had to be able to store very easily and not take up that much room. For that reason, I used some heavy-duty hinges on the two main parts of the Christmas tree, and that way when it's not in use for those 11 months of the year, it folds basically flat and makes it easier to store in the garage. I'm basically going to do an overview of how I put this together, the materials I used, and the mistakes I made during this project. So hopefully if you decide to make something similar to this, you don't make the same mistakes that I did. And let's get to it. I used a single sheet of plywood that I had laying around in order to cut the two diagonal pieces for the main part of the Christmas tree. The piece of plywood I had was a little over 6 feet tall. Each one of them was 30 inches wide at the bottom. And my wife had a tree gnome that she wanted to put as a tree topper. So I flattened them out at 3 inches at the top, and that way I could still put a small shelf up there in order to hold that. I did bevel these pieces at a 45-degree angle using my table saw, so when it folded into position, I had a nice clean edge. So the most expensive part of this project was this piece of plywood, and since I didn't want to have to go buy one, I did use one that I had laying around for quite some time, and it had a little bit of a warp to it. In order to anchor the hinges, I basically stood the two halves of the tree up in place and then screwed them in. Once anchoring the top and the bottom hinge, I unfolded it and laid it down on the ground to make it easier to put the rest of the hinges in. You'll notice that I had lighter duty hinges in at first and I had to replace them because I was using that piece of wood that I already had and it was a little warped. Those lighter duty hinges just weren't holding up and keeping it square when it was in the upright position. And I did end up adding a couple extra hinges as well for that same reason. Since plywood isn't that aesthetically pleasing on the front edge, we did add a couple pieces of 2x2 to those edges just to give it a much cleaner look. So being as though the piece of plywood that I had laying around was 5/8 of an inch thick, I was able just to pre-drill and countersink in some screws to hold these 2x2s in place. However, if you were going a little lighter duty, because you had to buy the product and you went with like 1/2 inch, you could obviously use some wood glue and some nails to hold these pieces of 2x2 in. I also went with screws because I was using it for strength because that plywood was a little warped. I ended up using some 1x2 material in order to put some brackets on the sides of the Christmas tree in order to hold the shelves. When anchoring these brackets in place, I recommend that you stand the tree up so you don't end up making those brackets too long where they're going to bind up when the tree is in the upright position. The other thing you could do is just stand it up real quick and take a pencil and make a light mark all the way down. That way you know where it is when it's in the upright position, so once again you don't make those brackets too long. I ended up using wood glue and nails in order to secure these brackets to the sides of the Christmas tree. Once tacking the first bracket in place, I put a straight edge across so I could match the bracket on the other side to the one I had anchored. That way I knew that when I made the shelf and set it in place, it was going to sit nice and flat on those brackets. And I did that for every shelf. In order to make the shelves, I just used a string line with a pencil in order to give me a nice clean rounded edge to follow when cutting. And then I did end up using my bandsaw in order to cut those shelves once I marked them out. When possible, I did try and find objects to mark out those shelves instead of using the string line and pencil because it was just easier. I figured I was just going to use the very top shelf in order to hold this thing together in the upright position, so I set it in place and then drilled 2 holes through the top shelf and into the sides. Then I used some screw-in anchors that had threads on the top so you could screw a nut onto it to hold it in place. Being as though I did have 5/8 plywood, I was able to use the bigger of these 2 anchors. So right here's the first time we just kind of set it up in the house to see how it was going to fit and how everything worked out. One thing I had to do on all 3 of the shelves was notch it around that piece of 2x2 because obviously it was wider than the plywood. However, this worked out well because once putting it together and having it doweled in, it helped hold those shelves from possibly falling off. So right here you can see I'm putting that top shelf on, which was going to be my main holding device, and threading those nuts onto those studs that I put into place up there. At this point, I realized that just that top shelf holding everything together wasn't enough, that if you ended up knocking the bottom of that tree, that it would open up enough where it would allow the shelves to fall out. So at this point, I decided to put it together and then drill 2 holes through the bottom shelf and into those 1x2 brackets and just put a dowel or a bolt in order to hold it from being able to spread open at the bottom. After that, all that was left to do was go ahead and paint it. And then here is the final assembly that we put together for this year. I do recommend having 2 people in order to set this thing up, and here's a good reason why, so you don't have cuss words flying during Christmas. That way one person can hold the shelves in place while the other person go ahead and gets whatever retaining device you decide to use in order to hold this thing together in place. So right here I just got some help to hold those shelves in place while I put the top on and threaded the nuts to help hold it together. So right here you can see we got the top piece on and it's bolted in place. However, the bottom is still opening up enough where it will let those shelves fall out. So I'm squeezing it together and then just putting some bolts in those holes I drilled in order to hold the bottom together. And I don't have any type of a nut on those bolts. I'm just using those basically as a dowel, pushing into another hole. Now, being as though I had those nuts sticking up above level on that top shelf, I did have to cut another piece of plywood and then drill some holes around those nuts so I'd have a level surface to set the tree gnome up there and he would be stable enough. And then I also added 2 hooks and a bungee to help stabilize him as well. I also added about 4 hooks down the front side of each one of the 2x2s to give us something to attach some strands of light or garland to each one of the front sides of that tree. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this Christmas village tree build and it gave you some good ideas to possibly make one of your own. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.